Fox tonight in what I think could have huge implications for the presidential race if anyone covered this. Fox News has learned that one of the people on an explosive email thread allegedly involving Hunter Biden has corroborated the veracity of the messages. One email dated May 13, 2017 and obtained by Fox includes a discussion of remuneration packages for 6 people in a business deal with a Chinese energy firm. The email includes a note that Hunter has some office expectations he will elaborate. Well, a proposed equity split references 20 for H and 10 held by H for the big guy. Well, sources now telling Fox News that the big guy is indeed a reference to the former vice president. Laura, in other words, Biden himself may have directly benefited from Hunter's dirty dealings with China. How big a deal of this is this potentially?
Well, potentially, if it is confirmed that this is accurate, and then there's probably more there. And it's particularly relevant right now because China is so much, in everybody's lives. All our lives have changed because of China, right? People have died because of China. And so it has more significance now than ever before. And it's always interesting to see, imagine if it was Russia, right? Could you imagine if it was Russia? You know exactly what the reaction would be. It would be everywhere. It would be all the time. It would be treated as a definitive conviction, and it would never end, right? You'd never hear the end of it. And when you look at the difference in standards like that, that's one of the things that makes people in this country lose faith in the media, because people are not stupid. They see what happens, and they recognize why that's happening.
Well, then, David, we have a piece tonight by David Ignatius in the Washington Post, which is playing cleanup for Biden. And he goes into great detail as to why this might have been personally bad judgment, but it's really not a big deal for Joe Biden. And he quotes some anonymous consultant who calls into question the emails, part of which we've just confirmed tonight on Fox News through one of the recipients of the email. So, he made a mistake getting involved in a dubious company like Burisma, but the notion that Burisma undermines Joe Biden's cases to be president, as he would say, is malarkey. David, cover up by the Washington Post, under the rug.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's not the only piece along those lines that the Washington Post has run today. They ran a very similar one by Max Boot. Let me be blunt. George Stephanopoulos' failure to ask Joe Biden last night about this bombshell New York Post story is the most egregious example of journalistic malpractice that I've ever seen, and that's a really competitive category these days. What makes it so astonishing is that the Biden campaign isn't even disputing the basic facts. I mean, the closest they've come is to say, well, there was no meeting on the official calendar. Really? I mean, it didn't say 3:30 p.m., met with Hunter's sketchy Ukrainian business partner? I mean, this is really outrageous, and the way that the media is trying to turn this into no story. First it was Russian disinformation. Now, maybe it's true, but it's not a big deal. It's extremely bad for the country.
Laura, Biden was finally asked about these revelations from the New York Post about his son Hunter, and here's what he said.
I know you'd ask it. I have no response. It's another smear campaign. It's right up your alley. They're the questions you always ask.
Laura, this is how they get away with it. It's a smear campaign when there's an email trail, but it's good journalism when it's suppositions set up by the deep state, as in Russiagate.
Well, they get away with it, Laura, as you say, because they're allowed to. Why? Because they have information dominance. They dominate most of the media, and they dominate the institutions that have, held credible places in our society for so long, that so many people grew up believing we're neutral, or at least tried to just play it down the middle. And as we see today over and over and over again, that's just not true anymore. And you have to look no further than the Steele dossier to see the evidence of that, right? Not only was it not unverified, it was pretty easy to verify. There were many things in that dossier that were absolutely untrue. But even if even if you went with that story in the beginning, what's your excuse for continuing to run with it
To
now?
run with
You'll
it
still
3
see it.
years.
Joe Biden, in one of the debates, he actually inferred the same thing over again and mentioned Putin and Russia and repeatedly does. How can you allow him to get away with that as a journalist? And I agree completely that not asking him about the whole issue with his son and Ukraine is very significant. I mean, it is not a small thing, because when you look at the extent of Biden's history with Ukraine, there are some very, very serious questions there in addition to this that have yet to be answered. So it's a further example of how, as the press's bias is being exposed, they're not even trying or pretending anymore. They're not just doubling down, they're ramping up on the bias, and yet they still demand to be viewed as credible and objective.
Yeah, well, this idea that you're going to pick among these people for debate moderators, David Marcus, I mean, I tweeted out earlier today that there should be a conservative and a liberal, someone who can do an interview. And if we're going to just have liberals do it, then there should be a liberal and a conservative, and that's it, and the two candidates, and that's it, and all is fair and in love and war here, and we'll just go at it. I'll be one, and we can get someone on one of the other networks to do the liberal side. But this is just ridiculous. The Republicans shouldn't even agree to these absurd moderators, given what we saw from Savannah Guthrie.
No, it's ridiculous. Now, look, I will say that I think, Trump is pugnacious. I think to some extent he brings that out of moderators or some people who interview him. Joe Biden's about as pugnacious as a marshmallow. But I like your idea. I even like the idea of let's get rid of the moderators. Let's just have the two guys stand there and go at each other. I frankly prefer that, I think.
Yeah, but then it would be the emperor has no blue cards. And Biden's always pulling out the cards with the numbers on it. That would be a disaster for him. Now, Laura, it's not just the bias. The media also, your favorite topic, they're trying to push off the Hunter Biden story involving China and Ukraine to bring back their favorite narrative.
There are fears that what Giuliani is now pushing here in the United States could actually be part of Russia's latest and very massive disinformation campaign in the U.S. presidential election.
Is it really possible that Giuliani wouldn't know these people were Russian assets?
How is this not an associate of the president colluding with Russian intelligence?
Laura, this is coming from the same people who spent years peddling actual Russian disinformation.
Yes, the exact same people, and this is what's so extraordinary about it, Laura, because it's not like the evidence isn't there. I mean, you just have to go back to the transcripts of what people like Clapper and Brennan and Rice were saying under oath. At the very same time, they were saying the opposite on television. I mean, that's just one example. And what's really disturbing about this to me is that as a journalist, I can understand, we all have our bias, and ideologically most of the media is very much aligned and in lockstep. And that's one thing. But when you actually know the truth, when it's staring you in the face, when you've received Pulitzer Prizes and you've run headlines, and you haven't run, 5 or 10 stories that have been incorrect, you've literally run hundreds, if not thousands. And then go onto any one of these websites today, whether it's for CNN or for any of the big papers, and see if there are 12 stories on a page, there will be 12 negative stories about Donald Trump. I mean, and that's day in and day out, day in and day out. So to claim that there's any kind of objectivity or moral authority at all is not just a joke. It's very deliberately and intentionally deceptive.
This is
and
why
it has real consequences.
This is why the only people who can run these things are multi-billionaires, because there's no accountability. They're losing money, most of them, and they're dying. They're dying on the vine, and they wonder why. Laura and David, it's great to see both of you tonight. Great voices on this. And coming out, troubling new COVID numbers coming out of Europe tonight revealed what we've been saying for months. Lockdowns do not work. Plus, why are